There were a group of travelers who came to a fork in the road. They came to this fork in the road and they had to make a decision. Which way will we go? To the left or to the right? Let me see from you guys. To the left or to the right? And so they were sitting there and they were looking and discussing it. What should we do? And the way to the left, it looked a little easier, and they could see other people on the road. And to the right, they couldn't really tell what that path was going to look like. But then there was this wise old hermit who was sitting there, and he said he lived there his whole life. And he told them, a lot of people go to the left, but I'd encourage you to go to the right. Because if you do, it's much more rewarding. And so then the people, they had this choice to make. And they had two choices. They could turn to the left like most people. Or they could turn to the right like the old man had suggested. Of course, the left looked easier. Like I said, there were lots of people there. But the right would be much more rewarding. At least that's what the man said. And if they believed him, and if they trusted him, well, they would have to believe him and trust him in order to experience that great reward that he was talking about. Now, this is just a simple little story, and I think we all understand it because we've all come to forks in the road, places where we've had to make a decision. Will I go left? Will I go right? But I think this is similar to what we experience as Christians living in this world. You see, the world offers us its idols. And by idols here, I'm not specifically talking about little wooden or stone images, although there are a few of those out here still. But the world offers us its idols, the things that it pursues rather than pursuing God. The world offers us its idols. The world offers us its ways of living. The world offers us its way of thinking. And sometimes it looks easier. And we look out and we say, hey, there's a lot of people doing this. And it may seem to be appealing because there are a lot of people doing it. And when the world offers us those things, we can choose to follow. However, God has called us to follow Him. God has called us to obey Him, to live by faith, to trust Him when He said, go my way. And you will find in the end it's far more rewarding. God calls us to know that His way is the right way and to find that reward and learn to know that it is far more rewarding. The thing is, throughout history, people have made these choices. Will I go to the left? Will I go to the right? Am I going to follow the world? Am I going to follow God? Many have followed the world and many have chosen to follow God. But the thing is as people have made these choices, entire cultures have changed based on the decisions of individuals and groups. And some cultures have turned to God, while others have turned away from God. Our culture looks like, for the most part, is turning away from God. So the question is, what will you do? Will you go to the left where most people are? Or will you go God's way? And what will we do as the church? Both this local expression of the church and the church in America. What will we do? Will we follow God? And today, as we look in Judges chapter 2, we can learn from Israel. We can learn to see what they did. And as we begin to look here again, we again see that at the beginning, they started well. Because at the beginning, they were serving the Lord. Look at Judges chapter 2, beginning in verse 6. It says, when Joshua dismissed the people of Israel went each to his inheritance to take possession of the land. Now, the previous verses we looked at, the ones we looked at last week, they describe the events after Joshua's death. But now we're talking about Joshua again, and Joshua's challenge to the people. This is kind of like a flashback. So they kind of gave us a summary, and now we're flashing back to Joshua again, and we're going to get a second summary. You see, chapter 1 summed up the conquest activities, when Israel went into the land, and how they took the land, and how they couldn't take some places, and how they didn't take some places. And we were told why that happened, why they were not able to. And we remember it wasn't because God was not able to, it was because they failed to follow, failed to trust, failed to have faith. And so last week that summed up the why and what happened around the conquest. And the focus there was on Israel's faith and obedience in regards to taking the land. And now as we come into chapter 2, we have another summary. And this one here summarizes actually what is recorded in the book of Judges. So this kind of summarizes what's going to happen throughout this book. But as we look at it, it steps back again to Joshua and his challenge of the people, when he challenged the people to obey God and to be faithful to God and to worship only God and to have nothing to do with the idols of the Canaanites. And so this summary here, beginning with Joshua's challenge, it focuses on Israel's faith and obedience in regards to idols, in regards to their loyalty to God, in regards to their purity, the purity of their worship. Now, why go all the way back to Joshua again? Because that challenge that he gave them to be faithful to God, to have nothing to do with idols, is very fitting to the subject at hand. And what he challenged them to do is exactly what Israel should have been doing. And as we continue to read, we'll see it is actually what they were doing at the time of Joshua's death. So back again, beginning in verse 6 again. It says, when Joshua dismissed the people of Israel went each to his inheritance to take possession of the land. And the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua, who had seen all the great work that the Lord had done for Israel. And Joshua, the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110 years. And they buried him within the boundaries of his inheritance in Timnath-Heres, in the hill country of Ephraim, north of the mountains of Gaash. Now, these verses that we just read are very similar to the end of the book of Joshua. And we saw that several months ago, but they're very similar to the end of Joshua. But there are a few variations, and I believe these variations here draw out some emphasis for us. They emphasize certain things. So in the end of Joshua, it says that Joshua sent away the people to their inheritance. But here, he says that the people went to take possession of the land. And so he's emphasizing here the task that the people had in front of them. They didn't just go home, but they went home to prepare to go and take the rest of the land that they were given by God. And so they went home to take the land, and they had to do that in faith. So they weren't just going home, but they were going to obey and to live by faith. Back in the book of Joshua, it says that they had known, this generation, these people who were going home, that they had known all the works that the Lord had done for Israel. But here in our passage in Judges, it says that they had seen or witnessed the great work God did for Israel. So not just all the works, but the great work. And you can see the emphasis there, right? What are they emphasizing? This wasn't no small thing that God did for Israel. He did awesome things for Israel. He did great things for Israel. And so his power was seen, and the greatness, his mercy, and his grace were seen. And so it explains here that God did these awesome things for them. And that explains their loyalty to God. Why were these people so eager to follow God and so eager to go take that land, or so eager, ready to trust God? Because they had seen the great things that he had done. They saw it firsthand, and they were ready to follow God. And that's what we see the words here. It says that the people served the Lord. They'd seen the awesome things he did, and they served the Lord. They knew who he was, and they served him. But how long did they serve him? Did you catch it? Well, as long as Joshua was alive, and as long as the others of that generation, the first generation that went into the land, were alive. We're told that they served the Lord. As long as Joshua and those others, his contemporaries, were alive, they served the Lord. And this generation, Joshua and his contemporaries, they're being held up as an example to us. You see, they did what was right. They served the Lord. They obeyed God. And then we're told that Joshua lived 110 years. You know what that means? He lived a long time. All right? He lived to a good old age. He lived in God's blessing. You see, God blessed him with those years. And then not only that, but they give us this little detail, and he was buried. Now, this isn't just telling us that Joshua was buried, but it says that he was buried in his allotted land. And where was it? In the land that God had promised to Israel. So where was Joshua when he died? He was in the land. So God had what? Fulfilled his promise to Joshua. And Joshua was there, and he was living there, and he died there in that promised land. And so this tells us then, or suggests to us that he received the promised blessings of God. And so God, who is faithful, and we established that last week, God, who is faithful, had given what he promised to his faithful servant. But look what we're told next. Look at verse 10. It said, and all that generation also were gathered to their fathers. So the generation that was alive at the time of Joshua, they all died. And there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord or the work that he had done for Israel. So the rest of that generation that had entered into the land with Joshua died off. And we could just read this as a matter of fact, it's just a detail of life. You live and then you die. But the following sentence gives this statement a bit of an ominous tone. Like there's something that's not quite right here. Like there's some foreshadowing. Because we look at the next sentence and we're told that this new generation rose up that did not know God. They did not know God or what he had done. And what this literally means is that they didn't see it with their own eyes. They didn't experience it. But of course, I have to ask, well, did they hear about it at least? Do they know? Do they hear about it? We don't really know for sure what they heard or what they were told. So then it raises the question in your mind, will they continue to serve God? Well, right away that question is answered for us. And we see them turning from God. Verses 11 to 13. It says, and the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. And they abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers, who brought them out of the land of Egypt. They went after other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were around them and bowed down to them. And they provoked the Lord to anger. They abandoned the Lord and served the Baals and the Ashtaroth. So in that first sentence, it says that they did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. What this refers to is their idolatry, that they went and served other gods. They abandoned God and went and worshipped other gods, and they started serving other gods. So our question, would they continue to serve God, is answered. No, they ran off and started serving other gods, false gods, idols. And so they rejected the one true God. It says that they abandoned the Lord. They rejected the one true God to chase after false gods. So they abandoned and rejected the one who had already promised them, if you obey me, I will bless you. If you trust me, I will give you this land. If you live by faith, things will go well with you. They abandoned the one who had already promised them, and the one who had helped their parents, and the one who their parents had worshipped and served. They rejected this God and walked away from him. The same God that had already delivered the whole nation from Egypt When they were slaves, and they should have known their history. They were slaves in Egypt. They were bound. There was nothing they could do. And God took them powerfully, took them out of that nation, the strongest nation of the known world at that time. God delivered them from Egypt. They turned away from this God. In other words, they turned away from their God, the one true God. But He was their God. They turned away from their own God to chase other gods, false gods, the gods of the people who were around them. Now, the crazy thing about this is that they're going after and they're chasing these false gods in order to try and find good things. You know, like they want better crops and they want to be successful in what they do. They're going after these gods to try and get good things. But God had already promised them, if you obey me, I'll give you those good things. So really, in a sense, it doesn't make any sense. But they went looking for those things that God had already promised from other sources, sources of their own choosing. And they turned away from God. Now we're told that by doing this, they provoked the Lord to anger. Now, His anger is justified here. Totally, completely justified. Because He was their God and they were His people. And they had a covenant together. Now the best way for us to understand this infidelity, this unfaithfulness, is to think of marriage. Because when you are married, you make a promise, a covenant with one another. The husband and the wife, they turn and say, I will be faithful to you till death do us part. And the husband has the right to assume that his wife is going to be faithful. And the wife has the right to assume that her husband is going to be faithful. They have a covenant, agreement. And if the wife goes off and has an affair, the husband has a right to be angry. And if the husband goes off and has an affair, the wife has a right to be angry. Because that covenant has been broken. Now we know any anger can turn to sin, but I'm not going there. But you understand. You have a right. It's justified anger. That covenant has been broken. And that is what has happened here. And they provoked the Lord to anger because they broke their covenant. So God, who was perfectly faithful and who kept all His promises, is now looking at a people who have not kept theirs. His people have not been faithful. Now I look at this and I can't help but ask, how did this happen? I mean, one generation is serving the Lord and the next generation turns from God. How did this happen? And I can't help think back to that statement that this new generation rose up who didn't know God or what He had done. And again, did they not hear? Were they not told? Were they not taught by their parents? I don't know exactly what happened there, but this is a reminder to us that we must teach kids about God. We must teach kids who He is. We must tell them of the great things He has done, the awesome things that He has done. We must help them to see when God is working in our lives and when God is working in their lives, so that they understand that God is doing great things, that God is not, these things don't just happen by accident, that these things aren't just coincidence, that these aren't just lucky. But we can look at it and say, look, God is blessing you. And when we tell our kids to pray about something, I heard someone talking this week and they said that one time their daughter they had moved and their daughter didn't have a friend and they said, well, let's pray about it. And the lady said, it was so hard because then I had to trust God because I was teaching my kids, let's pray about it. And then I had to trust God that when I pray and ask God to give her a friend, that He would do it. And then she walked away from praying with her daughter and had to deal with her own fears and her own lack of faith. And had to pray and ask God to help her have faith. But you see, when those prayers are answered, then we can turn and we can tell our kids, look what God did. And sometimes it may take a while. But we look and say, look what God did. And when God provides for us and God gives us gifts that we don't deserve, We say, look what God did. And we help them to see and experience the great things that God has done for us. We as adults need to help point those things out to kids. To our kids, to our grandkids, to other kids who we just see at church or in our neighborhood. We can tell them about the great things of God. Even around here, we can go to the ocean. We can say, look what God did. We can go watch the sunset and say, look what God is doing. We can point those things out to our kids to help them see the greatness of God so they might not turn from Him, but might know Him and the great things that He has done. Well, in our passage we see here that Israel went from a people that served the Lord to a people that have abandoned their God in order to chase after other gods of this world. And they would go on to experience both God's anger and mercy. Let's read in verse 14 and 15. It says, so the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and He gave them over to plunderers. Plunderers mean people who came in and took their stuff. Okay, so like they would grow their crops and people would say, hey, the Israelites have crops, let's go take it. So kind of like the playground bully here. But the bullies came in and they took their stuff, took their lunch money, took their crops. So God gave them over to plunderers who plundered them. And in the middle of verse 14, and He sold them into the hand of their surrounding enemies so that they could no longer withstand their enemies. Whenever they marched out, the hand of the Lord was against them for harm, as the Lord had warned, and as the Lord had sworn to them, and they were in terrible distress. You see, the people of Israel, they broke their covenant with God. They were unfaithful to God. And they put themselves in this position, a position of opposition to God, by breaking the covenant. Because God had promised them, if you obey me, I will bless you. But what else did He promise? If you disobey me, I will do what? Curse you. In other words, I will be against you. And it was all part of the covenant. So they put themselves in this position of opposition to God. And they are in a terrible place, a dark place, and they're having a terrible time. Because it says here that God gave them over to plunderers. He gave them over to those people who wanted to just come in and take their stuff. He made it so they couldn't stand up to their enemies. In other words, God allowed their enemies to overpower Israel and to come in and take their stuff. And there was nothing Israel could do about it. Now, catch the irony of this. This is happening because Israel abandoned God and went and chased after idols. Why did they chase after idols? Because they wanted more stuff. They were believing these idols would allow them to have good crops, to get more stuff. But what's happening? Their stuff is getting taken away. They've got less stuff because they've turned to these gods. All right? Not only that, but then when they go into battle, it's that the hand of the Lord was against them. Now that is a terrible thing to read. You do not want that to be said about you. That the hand of the Lord is against you. Because we saw what that meant for the Canaanites, right? When God was fighting for Israel, the Canaanites could not win. Because the hand of God was with Israel. But here what he's saying is that the hand of the Lord was against them. In other words, God fought against Israel. He didn't allow Israel to win. And so obviously Israel lost their battles. Again, the irony. God had promised them, if you follow me, if you obey me, if you have faith in me, I will fight for you. But the opposite is happening. That same power that would have been for them was now against them. And God is bringing these things against Israel in order to discipline them, in order to wake them up so they will realize what they're doing and turn back to God. But in the process of doing this, disciplining them, things became terrible for them. I mean, it was horrible. They were suffering. So look what God does next, verse 16. The Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hand of those who plundered them. Yet they did not listen to their judges, for they whored after other gods and bowed down to them. They soon turned aside from the way in which their fathers had walked, who had obeyed the commandments of the Lord, and they did not do so. Whenever the Lord raised up judges to judges for them, the Lord was with the judge, and he saved them from the hand of all of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord was moved to pity by their groaning because of those who afflicted and oppressed them. But whenever the judge died, they turned back and were more corrupt than their fathers, going after other gods, serving them and bowing down to them. So they did not drop any other practices or their stubborn ways. Now let's stop for just a second. I want to ask a question. Why in the world would Israel go after other gods? We talked about this a little bit. I don't remember if it was in Numbers or Exodus. Why would they go after other gods? Well, if you imagine, we were told that they worshiped the Baals. Now the Baals, it's plural there not because there are many different Baals, but there was one god, Baal, who was depicted in different ways in different localities, different locations. And so that's why it's plural there, the Baals. But it said that they worshiped the Baals. Well, Baal was a storm god and a fertility god. They believed that Baal brought the rain. The Canaanites believed that Baal brought the rain and then caused their crops to grow, hence fertility. They also worshiped the Ashtaroth, which was plural also for the same reason. But Ashtaroth was a goddess. She was, in the Canaanite mythology, she was Baal's like partner or counterpart. And she was a goddess of war and fertility. And so the Canaanites worshiped these gods, believing that these gods brought them rain and brought them good crops. The Israelites moved into town, into the land. The Israelites, before they settled in the land, were they farmers? Remember this? No, they were herdsmen. They kept cattle. So now they're coming into town, and now they're becoming farmers. They're settling down in the land, becoming farmers. And they come in and they look around, and the Canaanites are still there. And they look and they see the Canaanite practices, and they probably borrowed some practices from them. And they looked and said, well, they also worship these gods, and they believe these gods help them. And they've been working the land for many years, and they believe these gods help them. And at first they might think, that's kind of silly. But after a while they may say, well, maybe there's a point there. I mean, we've learned other things. Look at they do other things that are good. Maybe these gods actually can help you. And maybe then they start considering those things. And after a while, they may slip into that practice. Well, everyone else is doing it. And start chasing after other gods, hoping that these other gods would bring them good crops, forgetting that God had already promised them good crops if they simply obeyed Him. And so they go and they chase after these other gods. God disciplines them. And His discipline gets to a point where they are suffering and they're saying this is terrible and they're crying out. And so God raises up judges. Now we're talking judges, we're not talking about people who sit behind a bench and hear arguments and give just decisions about who's right, who's wrong, or who should be punished. We're not talking about that kind of a judge. We're talking about someone who comes and brings justice in a different way. Someone who brings justice by delivering God's people who are suffering injustice, who are suffering under oppression of others. So these judges are actually military leaders. And so God raises up these military leaders who come and help the people. So when things get too bad, He would raise up someone to deliver the people. And we're told that He was with the judges, that God was with the judges. In other words, He strengthened them. He caused them to be successful. But in these verses, there's no hint that the people repented or asked God for help. But we're told that God had pity on them. That when they were suffering, God had compassion on His people. And He helped them. And notice that The word whenever. So this isn't just something that happens one time where God disciplines them and he goes, oh man, they're suffering, I want to help them. But whenever, this is something that happened repeatedly. And over again, God sent judges to help his people, to deliver his people from the oppression of their enemies, the oppression of the people around it. He did it repeatedly. And you know, why did God do this? Because that's who God is. And I look at this and I'm like, this is awesome. God is awesome. You know, because he even though his people, Israel, had abandoned him, and even though they had provoked him to anger, God did not abandon his people. Even though he was having to discipline them, he did not abandon them. He did not reject them. He disciplined them, but he did not desert them. Instead, he showed them mercy. They deserved judgment, and he gave them help. Sounds a lot like our salvation. We deserve judgment, but he sent Jesus to die on the cross in our place, to give us help, the help that we needed. But see, this is how God is to his children. He's merciful, and he doesn't give us what we deserve, but he also does discipline us for our own good. Ephesians 2:4-5 says, but God, being rich in mercy, because of his great love with which he loved us. Being rich in mercy, in other words, he has a lot of it. He's not poor in mercy. He doesn't have a shortage of mercy. He's rich in mercy. He has tons of it, plenty of it. God is merciful. Being rich in mercy because of the great love with which he loved us. Even when we were dead in our trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved. So he's talking about our salvation here. Did we deserve to be saved? No. What did we deserve? Judgment for our sin. The wages of sin is death. That's what we had earned. That's what we deserved. But the gift of God is eternal life. Our salvation, our gift, it's a gift. It's his mercy. It's his grace. He shows us mercy and doesn't give us the punishment that we deserve, the judgment that we deserve. But instead, everyone who believes in Jesus is forgiven of their sins and is given eternal life. Grace, a gift that we didn't earn. Those verses go on to say it's not by works of righteousness which we've done. In other words, we didn't earn it. There's nothing we could do. It's a gift. It's his mercy. And everyone who believes in Jesus is given that gift. But I said God also disciplines us for our own good. In Hebrews chapter 12, it says this. Have you forgotten the exhortation that addresses you as sons? My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor be weary when reproved by him. He says, don't regard it lightly. In other words, don't ignore it. Don't think nothing of it. But take note of it. And don't go weary in it. In other words, it may be hard. You may be going through some hard times being disciplined, and it may be tough. But he said, don't grow weary. In other words, keep going, keep trusting, keep following him. That's the whole purpose of discipline, is that you turn to God and you start following him more closely. So he says, don't grow weary and don't regard it lightly. In other words, don't ignore it. He continues on, he says, for the Lord disciplines the ones he loves and chastises every son whom he receives. And I love that picture, because you know what that means? That means if God is disciplining you, you are a legitimate child of God. And he is disciplining you for your good, to bring you back to him so that you will do what's right and bring him glory. And you will receive the far greater reward than by following the other path, the path of the world. So he disciplines us to bring us back to him. And in verse 11 it continues, it says, for the moment, all discipline seems painful. Yeah, I don't remember any time being disciplined that I thought, hey, that's so fun. When I was a kid, I got spanked. And it didn't feel good. It was painful for the moment. Now there's a few I look back on and I say, I still am not happy about that. But he says, for the moment, it's painful, but you understand it's for your own good, and it helps you grow, and it brings out character, and it produces that character in you. He says, that's what it says. For the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. So discipline, it's not easy, but it helps us to grow and to become more like Jesus. To be righteous. But you see, that's what we see here, is that God will discipline you to bring you back to Him. And sometimes, when you're going through a hard time, we may be tempted to always think, well, I'm going through this hard time. Well, this is because someone's against me, or, it's an attack from Satan, or whatever it is. We have lots of things that we might blame it on, or maybe this person is just causing problems for me, and this person is just so strong, and this person just keeps doing it. And sometimes that's true, all those things that we just said. But sometimes we need to recognize that sometimes you may be suffering, not because of the strength of the enemy, but because of sin in your life. And sometimes we need to take a look at that and say, is there sin in my life? Is God disciplining me? Is God correcting me? Is God trying to get me to turn to Him and to follow Him more closely? And we need to take note of that and recognize that sometimes the hardships are not because of the strength of the enemy, but because of sin in your life. You must recognize when God is trying to get your attention, when He is correcting you. And confess that and get right with God. And at the same time recognize when God is showing you mercy. Well, back to the Israelites. Did you notice how long Israel responded to God's mercy? Right away it says that He sent the judges, and they were really happy for these judges. But how long did it last? Well, it was very short-lived. Because as soon as the judge died, they went right back to their old sinful ways. Look at verse 20. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and He said, because this people have transgressed my covenant that I commanded their fathers and have not obeyed my voice, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations that Joshua left when he died, in order to test Israel by them, whether they will take care to walk in the way of the Lord as their fathers did or not. So the Lord left those nations, not driving them out quickly, and He did not give them into the hand of Joshua. Now these are the nations that the Lord left to test Israel by them. That is, all in Israel, who had not experienced all the wars in Canaan. It was only in order that the generations of the people of Israel might know war, to teach war to those who had not known it before. These are the nations, the 5 lords of the Philistines, and all the Canaanites, and the Sidonians, and the Hivites, who lived on Mount Lebanon, from Mount Baal Hermon as far as Lebo Hamath. They were testing of Israel, to know whether Israel would obey the commandments of the Lord, which He commanded their fathers by the hand of Moses. So the people of Israel lived among the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And their daughters they took to themselves for wives, and their own daughters they gave to their sons, and they served their gods. So as we know, some of the Canaanites, we saw this last week, some of the Canaanites were still in the land. They didn't all get driven out. And there were Canaanites along with some other different inhabitants. We listed off several from here. They were still there. And it appears that at first God allowed them to stay in the land in order to teach war to the new generation. In other words, those who had not come with that first group into the land and fought in the battles, He's saying that he left them there to teach war to the next generation. Now that may sound kind of odd to us, but I don't believe that just simply means that He wants to teach Israel how to protect themselves against their enemies, or just teach them how to fight. But I think He wants to teach them how to fight battle as God's people. Now, what was the key to fighting battles as God's people? Faith, trusting God, following Him, obeying Him. So when it says that He wanted to teach them more, it wasn't just so they knew how to fight, but to know how to trust God and to have faith and to go into those battles with faith. And that faith was then expressed through following God, their sovereign leader, and taking the land that he had told them to take and obeying him through faith. However, what we see, what Israel did is after repeatedly turning from God, they went in the land, they started worshiping other gods. They repeatedly turned from God. He would send a judge and they'd turn back for a little bit and then go right back to their old ways. After repeatedly turning from God, now it states that God left them there in order to test their loyalty to God. So would Israel be loyal to God? Would they be faithful to God? You see, Israel had a choice. With all these people there, they could be faithful to God and worship Him only as they were told to, and they can obey Him in faith, or they could continue to compromise and to settle and to worship the idols of the people around them. And I believe here what God is doing is He's challenging His people to be careful to live in His ways. In other words, to be careful. In other words, to not just go through life and say, well, I'll just live and however I live, and if I happen to live in God's ways, then I do. And if this looks good, then I'll do that, and I'll do that. And but to be careful, in other words, to be purposeful, to follow God's ways, to do things God's way rather than man's, rather than the neighbors around you. And so He's challenging them to be careful to live in God's ways. But as we read this, do you notice the patience of God? Notice the patience of God. Because even now, He gives them another chance. After telling us that they would turn away from Him, the judge would come, they'd come back to God, they'd turn away, they'd turn away. After this repeated turning away, God still gives them another chance. He says, I'm going to leave these people here to test them so they would be careful to follow in my ways. You see, God is patient with His people. He's patient with us. He's merciful to us. But He calls us to get right with Him. He calls us to live in His ways. He disciplines us when we need it. And He waits for us to respond well to His mercy, to His patience. You see, we live in a culture, as I mentioned earlier, we live in a culture right here in America today that it seems has turned from God. But we as His people, we can be faithful to our God. We can turn to God and turn away from the idols of this world. We can be faithful to God and turning to Him. Or we can choose to compromise. We can choose to turn away from God and follow after the ways of our culture, of our world, the sinful ways. But I'm going to tell you, a turn from God is a turn for the worse. It leads to difficulty. It leads to consequences of sin that you have to then suffer. It leads to God's discipline. If you are a child of God and you turn away from Him, He will discipline you. But when a culture turns from God, it can lead to a dark and terrible time. We saw it here, we will see it as we look through Judges. It can lead to a dark and terrible time. And here in America, we may be headed there. But God is calling us as His children to listen to Him over the noise of our culture. Listen to Him rather than the noise of our culture. He's calling us to follow Him. Not to follow into our world into their own sinful ways, and not to follow them into their way of thinking, but to turn to Him, even if everyone else is looking the other direction. To take His path, even if everyone else is taking the other path. And why? Well, because He is God. And He is good. And He is merciful and patient and kind. So turn to Him. Look to Him. Keep your eyes on Him. Be loyal to your God.